The land office in Prescott smelled of ink and wood smoke, and Ada Wilcox had just set her satchel of ledgers on the counter when the clerk, a thin man named Mr. Prout, dropped the bar across the front door with a bang that rattled the window glass. "Everyone stand easy," Prout said, though his hands were shaking worse than anyone's. "I mean it. Stand easy." Ada turned from the counter to see three men crowding the small office, and though none of them had their pistols drawn yet, all three wore them low and loose, the way men wore guns when they wanted you to notice. The one in front, broad through the shoulders and dressed better than the other two, had a face she recognized from the description Robert Norris had given her only that morning, half in warning and half in apology, as though he regretted involving her at all. "You'll be Cole Tanner," she said before she could stop herself. The big man's eyebrows rose. "And you'll be nobody, I know, ma'am, which means you'll do well to step back from that counter." "I am the territorial librarian for this district," Ada said, drawing herself up the way her father had taught her to do before a room of skeptical school board men. "I have business with the recorder this morning the same as anyone else, and I intend to finish it." "Your business can wait." Tanner's eyes slid past her to Prout. "We are here for the water filing on Cottonwood Springs, the one filed in 1878 under the name Norris. Mr. Whitfield wants it produced, examined, and if it is defective, removed from the record. Today." Prout's throat worked. "That is not a lawful request, Mr. Tanner. Records are not removed because a man wishes them to be. Mr. Whitfield believes it will be lawful enough once the marshal understands the filing was fraudulent from the start." Tanner took a step closer to the counter, and his hand drifted, not quite touching his revolver, only reminding everyone that it was there. "Now you can hand it over friendly, or I can go through those drawers myself, and I expect I will not be gentle about it." Ada felt her heart beating high and fast in her throat, but she made herself breathe slowly, the way she had learned to do the first time a drunken freighter had put his hand on her book wagon, and she had needed her wits more than her nerve. She looked past Tanner's shoulder to the tall front window, where a wagon and two saddle horses stood hitched outside, and beyond them, coming up the muddy street at a fast walk with his hat pulled low, a man she had known for exactly 9 days. Robert Norris did not look like a man in any particular hurry, which she was beginning to understand was precisely how he looked when he was most dangerous to cross. He stepped up onto the boardwalk, glanced through the window, took in the barred door and the three strange horses, and did not draw his own pistol at all. Instead he knocked, twice, polite as a man calling on a Sunday. Prout startled. Tanner's eyes flicked toward the sound, and in that half-second, Ada did the only thing she could think to do. She swept the loose water filing papers on the counter, the ones Prout had already begun to pull for her, into the leather satchel among her library ledgers and land grant notices and correspondence, and let the flap fall closed over them as naturally as if she had only been tidying her own belongings. "Open it," Tanner called toward the door, not taking his eyes off Ada now. "Whoever that is, tell him to come around back." But Robert Norris did not wait for permission. The window beside the door was old, warped in its frame, and it took him only a moment to work the lower sash loose from the outside, as a man does who has spent a great many years learning how doors and windows fail to keep out anyone determined enough. He came through it sideways, quick and low, and by the time Tanner's two men understood a stranger was inside the room with them, Robert already had the bar off the front door and had it swinging wide, letting in the cold spring light and, more importantly, the sight of the street outside, where a deputy sheriff was walking his rounds not 40 yards off. "Morning," Robert said, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Mr. Prout, Miss Wilcox. Gentlemen, I believe that door was locked in error. Territorial Law Office Building, open to the public during business hours. I would hate for the deputy out there to think otherwise." Tanner's jaw worked. He was not a stupid man, and he understood at once what Robert had done, made it impossible for this to become gunplay in a public office with a lawman in easy shouting distance, without ever raising his own voice or his own weapon. "Norris," he said. Whitfield only wants the record. Whitfield can want a great many things, Robert said. He can want the moon plucked down and set in his watch pocket. That does not make it his to have. He looked to Prout. Has anything left this office unlawfully, Mr. Prout? No, sir, Prout said, finding his voice now that the door stood open and the world could see in. Nothing has left this office at all. It was, Ada thought, very nearly true, since the papers were still inside the building, tucked into her satchel rather than into the recorder's drawer, and she kept her face perfectly still and let Robert's steady gray eyes pass over her only once, just long enough to see that she was unhurt, before he turned back to Tanner. You'll want to tell Whitfield, Robert said, that if he sends armed men into a public office again, I will see to it the deputy hears of it directly, and the marshal after him, and every man on that jury will remember it came from Whitfield's mine and not from mine. Water rights are decided by law in this territory, not by who can put the most revolvers into a room. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Tanner spat to one side, jerked his chin at his two men, and walked out past Robert with the particular slow dignity of a man trying not to look as though he were retreating. The three horses clattered away down the muddy street, and Prout let out a breath that seemed to have been trapped in him since the door first slammed shut. Lord, Prout said, I have clerked in this office 6 years and never had a man threaten to go through my drawers before. You did well, Robert told him, and then to Ada, in a voice gone suddenly much less steady than it had been a moment before, Are you hurt? No, Ada said. Only my nerves, and I expect those will recover before supper. She set her satchel on the counter and drew out the papers she had swept away, laying them flat again as though she had never moved them at all, though her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady either. The filing is here, Mr. Prout. 1878 in the name of Robert Norris, for the waters of Cottonwood Springs and the wash below it. I believe you were about to make me a certified copy when we were interrupted. Prout looked from her to the papers to Robert Norris, and something in his narrow, ink-stained face suggested he understood a great deal more than he intended to say aloud. I believe I was, he said, and reached for his pen. It had been, as Ada had told Tanner, 9 days since she came to the Arizona territory believing she was traveling toward a husband, and she still was not entirely sure whether she had been traveling toward one instead, or merely toward this. She had come in on the Prescott and Phoenix stage 9 days before that confrontation, jolted and dust-caked after 2 days on the road, with her trunk of clothes and her crate of library books and pamphlets strapped to the boot, expecting to be met by a rancher named Robert Norris who had written her 5 careful, kind letters over the course of a winter, describing a horse ranch and stage relay station at a place called Cottonwood Springs, 2 boys who needed a mother's steady hand, and a hope. Plainly if awkwardly written, that a woman of her education and character might find contentment so far from everything she had known. What she had not expected, when the stage rattled to a stop in front of the relay station's low adobe walls, was for 2 boys, one perhaps 17 and gawky with it, the other younger and rounder in the face, to come tearing out of the barn shouting that she had arrived, only to be followed a moment later by a tall, sun-browned man with an axe still in his hand, and an expression of such complete and thunderstruck bewilderment that Ada had known at once something had gone terribly wrong. Ada Wilcox, she had said anyway, because there was nothing else to do but say it, climbing down from the stage with as much dignity as the dust and the long miles allowed. I believe you were expecting me, Mr. Norris. I was not, Robert Norris had said, and then, seeing her face change, had the grace to look stricken by his own words. That is, ma'am, I do not know what to say to you. I never wrote you any letter. It had taken the better part of an hour, standing in the yard while the stage horses were changed, and the driver pretended with great interest not to be listening, for the truth to come untangled. Daniel Norris, the older boy, had gone first pale and then defiant, admitting that he and his brother Charlie had found the matrimonial column in a Tucson paper old Ezra Prout left behind at the relay station, and had written to it themselves, signing their father's name, because their mother had been 2 years in her grave and their father worked from Cansee to Cansee, and never smiled any more and never would agree to such a foolish notion if they asked him plainly. So they had not asked him plainly at all. "We did not lie about you being kind, Pa," Charlie had said, close to tears. "We only guessed at it, on account of we know you are kind, even if you have forgotten how to show it since Ma died." Ada remembered standing in that yard, mortified and furious, and beneath both those things unexpectedly moved, watching a grown man's face work through anger and grief and something that might have been shame, all while his younger son clung to his sleeve and would not let go. "I am sorry, ma'am," Robert had said finally, turning to her with the particular stiffness of a proud man forced to apologize for something not his own doing. "You have come a long way on account of 2 boys' foolishness, and I have no right to ask you to stay another hour on my account. I will see the stage company puts you up in Prescott tonight, and I will pay your passage back east myself, whatever it costs me." It would have been easy, Ada thought later, to have taken the offer and gone. She had a position waiting with the Traveling Library Society regardless, a route to run along the stage road from Prescott down through the mining camps, delivering books and newspapers and letters to families who saw no other reading material from one season to the next. She did not need a husband to have a life in the territory. But something in the boys' faces, and something more, she admitted honestly to herself only much later, in the stubborn set of Robert Norris's jaw as he tried to do right by a stranger at his own son's expense, had made her say instead, "I have not come all this way to be sent back on the same stage, Mr. Norris, only because your sons showed more initiative than sense. I have library business in this district regardless. I will take a room at the relay station if your Mrs. Hobbs will have me, and we may all of us decide without any further foolishness what ought to be done." He had looked at her then with an expression she had not been able to name at the time, something between relief and alarm, as though she had proven both more reasonable and more unsettling than he had expected a bride ordered by mail to be. "You are not at all what I pictured," he admitted, low enough that only she heard it. "No," Ada had agreed. "I expect I am not." That had been 9 days ago. In the days between, she had taken a small room off the kitchen in the low adobe house that Mrs. Hobbs, the widow who cooked and kept house for the Norris men, shared with her own grown daughter. Ada had run her library route as planned, out along the stage road to 2 mining camps and back, and had returned each evening to a supper table where Robert Norris said little, watched a great deal, and seemed, she thought, to be waiting for her to reveal herself as either a fraud or a fool, so that he might send her away with a clear conscience. She had done neither. She had mended a torn harness strap with an awl she borrowed from the barn, having grown up patching her own father's book satchels. She had corrected Charlie's arithmetic and lent Daniel a battered copy of a survey manual when she learned he meant to study land law someday. She had listened, more than she had spoken, to the story of Sarah Norris, dead of a lung fever 2 winters back, and had said nothing at all when it became clear that Robert Norris still wore his grief like a coat he had forgotten how to take off. And on the 7th evening, when he had finally, awkwardly, asked her opinion on the water filing that Whitfield's mining company was contesting, she had recognized in the question not merely a request for help, but the first real offer of trust he had made her, and had accepted it as such, agreeing to go with him to Prescott to see the record for herself. Now, standing in the land office with the certified copy of that record safely folded into her satchel and Robert Norris's gray eyes still resting on her, with an expression that was no longer bewilderment but something warmer and far more unsettling, Ada understood that whatever had begun 9 days ago in that dusty yard had not ended with Tanner's retreat. If anything, it had only just properly begun. They did not linger in Prescott. Robert paid Prout for the certified copy and a second copy besides, folded them both inside an old cloth against the weather, and settled the packet inside his coat rather than in any saddlebag where a curious hand might find it. He had brought the light spring wagon rather than ride horseback, he explained, because the road home crossed 2 washes that the spring thaw had likely swollen since morning, and a wagon gave more options than a horse if the crossing proved bad. "You think Tanner will follow," Ada said, as they climbed up onto the wagon seat together, the mismatched bay geldings shifting in their traces. "I think Whitfield is a man who does not enjoy losing, and Tanner is the sort who does whatever keeps him fed." Robert took up the reins, and the wagon lurched forward onto the rutted street. "We will not make Cottonwood Springs before dark regardless. I mean to camp at Willow Bend Crossing and go on at first light when I can see the water better." Ada considered this, and considered too the particular quiet that had fallen between them since Prescott, a quiet that felt different from the wary silences of the past 9 days. "Mr. Norris," she said, "you came through that window very quickly for a man who claims not to enjoy trouble." Something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though his eyes stayed on the road. "I did not always earn my living quietly, Miss Wilcox. Some old habits are more useful than others." It was the first time he had admitted, even obliquely, to anything of a life before Cottonwood Springs, and Ada, sensing the door had opened only a crack, did not push it further open than he was willing to allow. "Well," she said instead, "I am obliged to your old habits, whatever they are, since I do not fancy explaining to Mr. Whitfield's men why a librarian happened to be carrying his stolen water filing in her satchel." That earned her an actual laugh, short and surprised as though it had escaped him before he could stop it. "No," he agreed, "I do not suppose you do." They reached Willow Bend as the sun was dropping behind the Bradshaw Peaks, the sky gone the color of a ripe peach above the dark hills, and found the crossing already running higher and faster than Robert liked. He walked the bank a while in the fading light, testing the ground with a long stick, while Ada unhitched the horses and picketed them on the good grass a little back from the water, a task she performed with an ease that made Robert glance at her twice before he said anything. "You have handled harness before," he said finally. "My father kept a mule for the book wagon when I was young, before the society could afford a proper team," Ada said. "I did a great many things a schoolteacher's daughter was not supposed to know how to do, Mr. Norris. Educated does not mean helpless, whatever some men assume." He had the grace to look faintly abashed. "I confess I thought exactly that, the day you stepped off the stage in your traveling gloves with your hair still perfectly pinned after 2 days on a bad road. I thought, here is a woman who will wilt inside a week and beg to be sent home. And now I have seen you hide a stolen water filing under Cole Tanner's nose without your hands shaking, and pin the horse's picket line tighter than my own sons manage it." He shook his head slightly, more to himself than to her. "I have been wrong about you from the first hour, Miss Wilcox, and I am man enough to say so." They forded no water that night. Instead, they made a cold camp above the crossing, a small fire shielded in a hollow of rock so its light would not carry far, and Robert insisted on taking the first watch himself, though Ada, wrapped in a blanket with her back against a boulder still faintly warm from the day's sun, found she was not tired enough to sleep. "You need not sit up with me," Robert said, when she settled instead onto a flat stone near enough to speak without raising her voice. "I have kept watch alone plenty of nights." "I imagine you have," Ada said. "But I find I would rather talk than lie awake listening to the water and imagining Tanner behind every mesquite bush. Tell me something true, Mr. Norris. You have given me a great many careful, polite half-answers since I arrived. I would like one true thing before I try to sleep." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse outright. The fire popped once, sending up a small spray of sparks that died before they reached the branches overhead. Somewhere down in the wash, water moved over stone with a low, steady voice of its own. "My name was not always Norris," he said at last. Ada kept very still, sensing that any sudden movement, any too quick sympathy, might close the door again before it had properly opened. "Go on," she said simply. I was born Robert Slade in Texas before the war ended anything worth ending, he said. My father did not come home from it. My mother died the winter after, of nothing the doctor could name beyond grief and hunger together, and I was 13 years old with no one left who claimed me. I fell in with men who fed me because I was useful to them, and by the time I was old enough to know better, I was riding with them regardless, because I did not know how to be anything else. What sort of men? The sort who took what they wanted from stagecoaches and way stations, when the roads were thin on law and thick on desperate men. He said it plainly, without flinching from it, though his hands, resting on his knees, had gone very still. I never killed a man, Miss Wilcox, not in all that time, and I thank God for it now, though I do not know that it excuses the rest. There was a night outside of Fort Griffin when the man who led us meant to burn a station house with a family still inside it, to leave no witness. I would not stand for it. I helped the family out the back while the others argued over it, and I rode away that same night and never went back. I took my mother's maiden name because Slade was not a name I wished to carry any farther, and I came west, and eventually I came here. And the men you left behind, 2 are dead. 1 is in the Yuma prison and has been for years. The last I heard of the leader, he had gone north to Montana, and I have heard nothing since. I do not believe any lawman living has cause to look for Robert Slade anymore, but I have never been entirely certain of that. And a man like Whitfield, if he learned of it, would use it against me without a second thought. Ada let the silence sit a moment, turning his words over with the same careful attention she gave to a difficult passage in a book, wanting to be certain she answered the truth and not merely her own first feeling. You did not kill anyone, she said finally. You risked yourself to save a family, and you have spent every year since building something honest out of what was left. That is not nothing, Mr. Norris. That is, I think, rather a great deal. You are not afraid of me. I am not afraid of the man who came through that window to stand between me and 3 armed strangers without once drawing his own gun, Ada said. I do not see how learning why he learned to move that quickly should frighten me now. He looked at her across the small fire for a long moment, something raw and grateful and still faintly disbelieving in his face, and Ada felt her own heart turn over slowly, the way it had not done in a very long while, not since before her mother died and her father's health failed, and she had learned to keep her heart carefully folded away where disappointment could not easily reach it. Your turn, Robert said softly. You did not answer a matrimonial letter, because you had nothing better to do, Miss Wilcox. A woman with your education, your composure, could have her pick of positions in any city back east. Tell me something true as well. Ada looked down at her own hands a moment before she spoke. My mother died when I was 20. My father, after, could not keep the household accounts straight nor his own grief in check, and by the time he passed 2 years later, the debts had eaten nearly everything, including the small subscription library he had spent his life building. I was left with an education and no fortune to go with it. In a city full of families who wanted a governess they could pay almost nothing, or a wife they could display and otherwise ignore. I answered the letter, if I am honest, because it promised something I had stopped believing I would find, which was a life that might belong to me rather than to someone else's idea of what a woman ought to want. And do you find it here? I do not yet know, Ada said honestly. I have found 2 boys who need a mother's hand more than they will admit, a house that could stand a woman's ordering, and a man who apologizes for his son's foolishness before he ever considers what he himself might gain by it. I have found, tonight, a great deal more honesty than I expected from a matrimonial correspondence begun by 2 boys under 14 and 17 years old. That drew a real laugh from him, low and warm in the darkness, and something in her chest loosened at the sound of it. I do not know how to court a woman properly, Miss Wilcox, Robert admitted. I have not tried, not since Sarah, and that was a different sort of courting altogether, both of us barely 20 and neither of us carrying half what we carry now. I am not asking to be courted properly, Ada said. I am asking only that whatever happens between us happen honestly, Mr. Norris, and out in the open, and not because two boys wished it before either of us did." "Robert," he said, "if we are being honest, you might as well use my name." "Robert," Ada repeated, and found she liked the shape of it in her mouth rather more than she had expected to. "Then you had better call me Ada, and we will begin as we mean to go on." They did not kiss that night, though Ada thought later that the wanting had been there already, banked low like the coals of their small fire, needing only time and a little more courage before it caught properly. Instead, they sat a while longer in companionable quiet, and when at last she did sleep, wrapped in her blanket with the sound of the rising creek for company, she slept more soundly than she had any night since leaving Ohio. They crossed Willow Bend at first light without incident, the water having dropped a hand's width overnight, and reached Cottonwood Springs by early afternoon to find Daniel and Charlie both watching the road from the corral fence, and Mrs. Hobbs standing in the doorway with her apron twisted in her hands. "Trouble," Mrs. Hobbs said, before either of them had climbed down from the wagon. "Mr. Whitfield himself rode out here yesterday afternoon, with two men behind him, asking after the water filing and asking after you, Robert Norris, in a manner I did not care for at all. He asked after me by name." Robert's voice had gone careful. "By your name and by another, Mrs." Hobbs said, lowering her voice though there was no one nearby to overhear. "He asked young Daniel here whether his father had ever gone by the name Slade." Ada watched Robert's face carefully and saw the color drain from it, quick and complete, before he mastered himself. Daniel, standing at the fence, looked stricken. "I did not tell him anything, Pa," the boy said quickly. "I said I did not know what he meant, but he looked at me like he already knew the answer and only wanted to see my face when he asked." "You did right," Robert said, though his voice was tight. "You did exactly right, son." That evening, after the boys were sent to their chores and Mrs. Hobbs to her kitchen, Robert and Ada sat at the long table with the certified water filing spread between them and the greater problem, unspoken but present in the room like a third guest, of what Whitfield now knew or suspected. "He means to use it," Robert said. "Whatever he has learned or guesses, he means to use it to force my hand on the water rather than settle it lawfully." "Then we must settle it lawfully before he has the chance," Ada said. "The filing is sound, Robert. I read every word of it on the road home. Your father-in-law filed it properly in 1878 for both irrigation and stock water along Cottonwood Wash, and it has never lapsed because this ranch has used that water every season since, which is exactly what the doctrine requires. Whitfield's mine has no prior claim at all. His flume project is entirely reliant on either buying you out or frightening you into abandoning the filing. That will not stop him going to the marshal with an old rumor about a man named Slade." "No," Ada agreed, "but it may stop him having any lawful reason to." "A man's past, however troubled, is not evidence against a water filing, Robert, and if the marshal is a reasonable man, he will want proof of an actual crime, not merely a name half-remembered from 20 years past. What has Whitfield truly got besides a guess?" Robert considered this, some of the tightness easing from his shoulders as he did. "Perhaps only the guess. Perhaps a description if he has written to someone in Texas. I do not know how far he has looked." "Then we do not hand him more than a guess to work with," Ada said. "We finish settling this water question through the land office, publicly and properly, so that whatever he threatens afterward looks exactly like what it is, a desperate man trying to punish a family for refusing to be bullied." It was, Robert told her later, the first time since Sarah died that another person had sat across a table from him and helped him see a way through trouble rather than simply grieving alongside him or leaving him to manage it alone. And something in him, some old locked door, had begun that evening to come open. The confrontation, when it came 4 days later, in the gray hour just after sunup when the spring runoff always ran fullest, swollen by the night's freeze, finally releasing its grip on the high snow. Ada had gone out to the springs herself that morning to check the small header gate Robert used to divert water into his irrigation ditch, a habit she had taken up in her days at the ranch, finding a strange peace in the cold, clear water and the birdsong along the willows. And it was there that Vance Whitfield found her, riding up with Cole Tanner and 4 other men behind him. Whitfield was not what she had expected. He was younger than Robert, perhaps 30, dressed with a careful attention to fashion that seemed almost absurd against the muddy banks of Cottonwood Wash, and his face, when he swept his hat off to her, was pleasant enough that she understood at once how he had likely charmed a great many investors out of a great deal of money. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "I confess I did not expect to find the territorial librarian standing guard over a header gate at this hour. I did not expect to find a mining superintendent doing the same, Mr. Whitfield," Ada answered evenly, "though I suppose we are both of us up early on someone else's account. I am up early on behalf of 40 men and their families in Silver Fork Camp, who will have no water for drinking nor for the stamp mill by summer if this creek is not properly managed," Whitfield said, and there was, Ada thought, real strain beneath the charm, the particular tightness of a man who genuinely feared for something he was responsible for, whatever else drove him besides. "I do not enjoy being cast as a villain in this, Miss Wilcox. I have men whose wages depend on that mill running, and children in that camp who need clean water same as any child here." "Then perhaps," Ada said carefully, "the answer is not to seize a filing that does not belong to you, but to seek a lawful arrangement that serves both the camp and this valley. I offered Norris a fair price for the water rights outright more than once." "You offered to buy what the law says he need not sell," Ada said. "That is not the same as fair, Mr. Whitfield, whatever figure you attach to it." Robert arrived then, having seen the riders from the yard, walking down toward the springs with Daniel close behind him, carrying nothing more threatening than a coil of rope, though his young face was set with a determination that made Ada's chest ache a little to see it. "Whitfield," Robert said, "you are on my land." "I am on land that sits above water my camp cannot survive without," Whitfield said. "I came to speak plainly, Norris, since threats and lawyers have gotten neither of us anywhere. I know something of your history. I have written to a man in Texas who remembers the name Slade rather better than you might wish. I do not say this to threaten you in front of your son and your intended, though I understand how it will sound. I say it because I am out of patience and out of time, and I mean to have this water one way or the other before my investors pull out and this whole camp starts starving." The silence that followed felt to Ada like the held breath before a shot, and she saw Daniel's face go white, saw Robert's hand tighten at his side, and understood that this was the moment, more than any land office standoff, that would decide what kind of man Vance Whitfield truly was. "Say what you know, then," Robert said, low and steady. "Say it plainly in front of my son, since you have already said half of it." Whitfield seemed almost taken aback by the lack of fear in Robert's voice. "I know you rode with outlaws in Texas as a young man, under the name Slade. I know a station house near Fort Griffin was nearly burned with a family inside it, and that the man they call Slade helped that family escape before vanishing. That is all you know. That is all I have been able to learn, yes." "Then you know," Robert said, "that whatever I was also the one who stopped that fire from happening. You know I have not carried a stolen dollar in 20 years, that I have raised 2 sons on honest wages, that this ranch and this water filing were earned through my late wife's father and worked faithfully every season since. If you wish to ride into Prescott and tell the marshal that a boy of 13, orphaned by the war, once rode with bad men and left them the first chance he got to do right, you are welcome to try it. I do not think it will buy you the water you need, Mr. Whitfield, and I think you know that too, or you would have gone to the marshal already instead of riding out here to tell me yourself." For a long moment Whitfield said nothing at all, and Ada watched something shift behind his eyes, some calculation giving way, however reluctantly, to a grudging respect he had clearly not expected to feel. "No," Whitfield admitted finally. "I do not suppose it would. I came out here half hoping you would panic and sell cheap, Norris, and half hoping, I will admit, that you would give me some better reason to hate you than simple bad luck and bad timing. You have given me neither." He settled his hat back onto his head. "The water will still run out for my camp within the month, filing or no filing. That trouble does not go away because I have failed to frighten you out of it." "No," Ada said before Robert could answer, "but it might yet be solved another way if you are willing to sit down as neighbors rather than enemies. This creek is fuller right now, this week, than it has been in 10 years, by every account I have heard since I arrived. The question is not only who owns the water in law, but how it might be shared through the season so that neither camp nor ranch runs dry come August. That is an engineering question as much as a legal one, and I do not believe either of you has properly sat down to solve it." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, then at Robert, and something like a tired, unwilling smile crossed his face. "You did not travel out here merely to be a bride, did you, Miss Wilcox?" "I traveled out here to bring books and letters to families who see little enough of either," Ada said. "It appears I have found rather more use for myself than that. Come back in 3 days, Mr. Whitfield, with your camp's engineer if you have one, and we will look at this creek properly in daylight, without armed men standing behind either of us." It was, Ada thought, as Whitfield finally turned his horse and rode away with his men trailing after him, not a victory exactly, but it was the first crack of daylight in a conflict that had seemed, only moments before, ready to end in gunfire on a spring morning with a 17-year-old boy standing close enough to be hurt by it. Robert turned to her once the riders were well down the road, and the look on his face was one she would remember for a long time afterward, something between astonishment and a fierce, unguarded pride that had nothing at all to do with the water rights. "I did not marry a wilting eastern flower after all," he said. "You have not married anyone yet, Robert Norris," Ada pointed out, though she was smiling despite herself. "No," he agreed, stepping closer, close enough that Daniel discreetly found something urgent to attend to at the corral. "Not yet." He did not kiss her then, though Ada thought he wanted to, and she thought too that she would not have stopped him if he had. But 3 days remained before Whitfield's promised meeting, and the sky to the north had already begun to pile up dark and heavy over the Bradshaw Peaks, and neither of them yet knew how little time that promise would actually be given to keep. The rain came that night and did not stop for 2 days, a hard, driving spring storm on top of snow already melting fast in the high country, and by the 3rd morning, when Whitfield was due to ride out for his promised meeting, Cottonwood Wash had become something Ada had never seen a creek become, a wide brown torrent tearing at its banks, carrying whole uprooted mesquites down from higher ground and roaring loud enough to be heard from the house. Was old Ezra, the leathery stage-line hostler who had worked the Cottonwood Springs relay for 20 years, who came pounding on the door before full light with the news that turned a bad flood into a true emergency. "Whitfield's flume," he said, gasping, having ridden down from the mining camp road through the worst of it. "He started building a rock and timber diversion upstream of here last month, without leave from anyone, meaning to force the water toward his camp regardless how this filing came out. It was never built to hold what is coming down off the mountain now. Miguel Ortega rode past it an hour ago and says it is groaning like a dying animal, and if it lets go all at once, that wall of water will take out every homestead and half of Silver Fork Camp both, straight down the wash." Robert was already pulling on his boots before Ezra finished speaking. "How much time?" "An hour, maybe 2 if the rain holds off, less if it does not." Ada felt the old cold clarity settle over her, the same steadiness that had let her hide a stolen filing from 3 armed men without her hands shaking, and she was already reaching for her boots and her oiled coat before she had entirely finished thinking the plan through. 2 hours is enough time to save lives if we use it rightly," she said. "But we cannot save the mining camp and this valley both by wishing the water away, Robert. We need to open a controlled channel to spread that flood safely before the dam breaks on its own and sends it all at once. There is an old dry wash south of the springs, Robert said slowly, already picturing the ground. Wider, flatter, runs off toward open desert where it can spread and lose its force instead of tearing through the settlement. If we can cut a channel from the main wash into that dry bed before the dam lets go, it might take enough of the water to save both the camp below and the homesteads along the main course. Then that is what we do, Ada said. We warn everyone first. Every minute matters more for lives than for ditches. What followed was, Ada would remember afterward, the most purely frightening and most purely alive she had ever felt in her life. Robert sent Daniel riding hard for the Ortega place and the 2 other homesteads along the lower wash, shouting the warning at every door, while Charlie was sent, protesting furiously at being left out of the real danger, to ride for Mrs. Hobbs and gather what tools and hands could be spared from the relay station itself. Robert and Ada, with Ezra and 2 of the hostlers, took picks and shovels and a scraper blade meant for road grading, and began cutting into the low bank between the main wash and the old dry channel, working in the driving rain with the roar of the swollen creek not 50 yards off, deafening and immediate. It was brutal, exhausting work, made worse by mud that swallowed boots to the ankle and a rain that found its way down every collar no matter how tightly buttoned. And twice Ada slipped on the churned bank and would have gone into the flood herself if Robert had not caught her arm both times, hauling her back with a grip that left bruises she would not discover until the following day and did not mind at all. Miguel Ortega arrived with his own 2 grown sons and a wagon of fence posts and brush to reinforce the channel banks once cut, and Alina Ortega came close behind with blankets and hot coffee carried in tin pails, moving among the working men and women like a small, fierce general of her own. And it struck Ada, even in the midst of the danger, how quickly a scattered handful of strangers and near strangers had become, in the space of 2 desperate hours. Something very much like a single determined family. Word came down from the mining camp itself an hour into the work, carried by a rider on a lathered horse, that Vance Whitfield had abandoned his ride to the meeting the moment he understood what his own unlawful dam was about to do, and had instead turned his own men out with picks and shovels to help widen the diversion cut from their side, working frantically to save the very valley he had spent a month trying to control. He arrived on foot at last, soaked through and streaked with mud to his elbows, his fine coat abandoned somewhere behind him, and set to work beside Robert Norris without a single word passing between them beyond the practical business of where a shovel was most needed. The dam let go at last with a sound Ada would remember for the rest of her life, a deep tearing groan followed by a crack like cannon fire, and the wall of brown water that came surging down the main wash a moment later was terrible to see, tearing out young cottonwoods and carrying boulders the size of barrels tumbling end over end in its grip. But the diversion channel held. Not perfectly, not without a heart-stopping moment when a section of the new bank began to slump, and Robert himself waded knee-deep into the racing water with an armful of brush and fence posts to shore it up, Ada screaming his name over the roar without any memory afterward of having decided to scream at all. But the channel held long enough, and widened fast enough under its own furious pressure, to carry the greater part of the flood harmlessly out into the open desert flat to the south, sparing both the homesteads along the lower wash and the mining camp above. When it was over, when the worst of the water had passed, and only a swollen, exhausted creek remained where a killing flood had roared through an hour before, Robert Norris came up out of the wash soaked and shaking with cold and effort. And Ada did not think, did not weigh what was proper or what watching eyes might make of it, but simply crossed the churned mud and put her arms around him, holding on as though she might otherwise lose him to the water even now that the danger had passed. "You fool man," she said into his soaked collar, half laughing and half weeping with the release of it. "You might have been killed." "So might you," standing on that bank screaming my name instead of stepping back from it," Robert said, and there was a rough tenderness in his voice she had not heard from him before. He pulled back just far enough to look at her properly, mud-streaked and rain-soaked, and entirely unlike the composed librarian who had stepped off the Prescott stage 9 days before that flood, and something in his face made the whole exhausted, mud-caked world around them go very quiet and very still. "Ada Wilcox," he said, "I do not believe I have ever been more certain of anything than I am, standing here half-drowned in this creek, that I do not wish you to go back east, nor anywhere else ever again." "That is a very poor imitation of a proper proposal, Robert Norris," Ada said, though her voice was not steady at all. "I will make you a proper one later, in dry clothes, on my knees if you require it," he said. "But I find I cannot wait even that long to do this." And he kissed her then, there in the mud with the flood still roaring, past a stone's throw away and half of 2 communities watching without any pretense of not watching. And Ada Wilcox, who had crossed a continent on the strength of 2 boys' forged letters and her own quiet hope for a life that might belong to her, kissed him back and did not care in the least who saw. It was Vance Whitfield, of all people, standing nearby with mud to his elbows and his fine coat somewhere miles downstream, who broke the moment at last with a tired, rueful laugh. "I came out here today to fight you over a filing, Norris," he said, "and instead I have helped save your ranch and watched you propose marriage in a flooded ditch. I do not know what to make of this territory some days." "You came out here to save your own camp too, Whitfield, whatever else brought you," Robert said, releasing Ada only far enough to face the other man properly. "That dam was never lawful and you know it, but you turned your men out the moment it mattered, and that counts for something." Whitfield was quiet a moment, looking back up the wash toward where his illegal works had stood an hour before, now nothing but scattered timber and torn earth. "I built that thing because I was frightened, and pride would not let me come to you honestly and ask for help instead of trying to take what I needed," he admitted. "I have made a poor showing of this whole business, Miss Wilcox Norris, and I am sorry for it, more sorry than I have said." "Then let us finish what we began 3 days ago, properly this time," Ada said, wringing water from her sleeve with as much dignity as she could manage. "There is more water in this creek most seasons than either the ranch or the camp alone requires, if it is shared wisely and not fought over out of pride. Bring your engineer, Mr. Whitfield, whenever the road's dry enough to travel, and we will draw up a proper compact, filed with the land office and binding on you as much as on Robert. I believe I still have Mr. Prute's certified copy in my satchel, safely dry, which is rather more than I can say for any of the rest of us just now." It made even Whitfield laugh, a real laugh this time, tired and human. "I believe that may be the strangest peace treaty ever negotiated in this territory," he said, settled by a librarian standing in the mud with her hair coming down around her ears. "I have found," Ada said, glancing sideways at Robert with a warmth she no longer troubled to hide, "that a great many important things in this territory seem to get settled in rather less dignified circumstances than the histories will likely record." The weeks that followed passed in a kind of busy, sunlit haze that Ada would look back on for the rest of her life as the happiest of her whole existence. The water compact was drawn up properly within the month, once the roads dried enough for Whitfield's mining engineer to survey the creek alongside Robert and old Ezra, granting Silver Fork Camp a fair share of the flow through a lawfully built and maintained flume, while preserving every right the original 1878 filing had promised to Cottonwood Springs and the homesteads along the wash. Whitfield paid, as a mark of good faith and no small amount of genuine gratitude, for the proper timber and stonework of the new diversion himself, and the flume that rose that spring above Cottonwood Wash stood, unlike his first desperate effort, straight and sound and built to last. Robert's past troubled them only once more, when a territorial marshal did indeed ride out from Prescott some weeks later, having received Whitfield's earlier letter forwarded on from a lawman in Texas. But the Texas lawman's own records, once properly examined, showed no warrant, no charge, and no crime ever laid at the door of a boy named Robert Slade beyond the general suspicion attached to bad company kept in worse times. And the marshal, a practical man with no interest in chasing 20-year-old rumors about a rancher who had spent 2 decades building an honest life, closed the inquiry over a cup of Mrs. Hobbs's coffee and rode back to Prescott without further trouble. Robert told Ada that evening, sitting together on the porch in the blue spring dusk, that it was the first time in 20 years he had gone to sleep without some small cold knot of fear in his chest. And Ada, resting her head against his shoulder, thought that she had never before understood quite how much a person's whole life could change simply from being finally, fully known and not turned away for it. They were married in June, in the yard at Cottonwood Springs beneath the old cottonwoods that gave the place its name, with Daniel standing proud and solemn beside his father, and Charlie grinning so widely throughout the ceremony that Mrs. Hobbs had to hush him twice, and Alina Ortega had woven wildflowers, grown thick and unexpected that year from all the spring rain, into a crown for Ada's hair. Vance Whitfield rode down from Silver Fork Camp to attend, bringing a case of good glass tumblers as a wedding gift, and a rather sheepish toast about creaks and stubbornness and second chances that made the whole gathered company laugh. In the months after, Robert and Ada turned the old relay station into something neither of them could quite have imagined alone. The stage company, learning of the new water compact and the reliable flume that now kept Cottonwood Springs running strong through every season, made the station a proper home stop on the line, with fresh teams always ready, and a trading post stocked with goods for the ranches and camps for miles around. And in one corner of the new trading post building, built with lumber Robert and Daniel milled themselves, that autumn, Ada set up shelves of her own, the beginning of a proper lending library and reading room, open to every homesteader's child and every miner off shift who wished to borrow a book or write a letter home. The traveling library finally given a permanent branch to grow from rather than only a wagon passing through. On quiet evenings, once the boys were grown enough to manage the horse changes themselves and Mrs. Hobbs had retired to her own small house nearby with her daughter, Robert and Ada would sit together on the porch of the home they had built into something entirely their own, watching the creek run steady and full below the springs. And Ada would sometimes think back to that terrified morning in the Prescott Land office, and to the 2 boys who had set the whole improbable chain of events in motion with nothing more than a forged letter and a fierce, clumsy love for their father. "I ought to be angry with them still," she said once, laughing softly into the dusk. "They deceived us both terribly." "They gave me the truest gift anyone has given me since Sarah died," Robert said, taking her hand in the gathering dark. "I will not pretend otherwise, whatever foolishness got you here. You arrived before I ever had the chance to object, Ada Wilcox, and I have thanked God for it every day since." "Ada Norris," she corrected him gently, though her smile did not waver. "Ada Norris," he agreed, and kissed her there on the porch of the home and the business and the whole unlikely, hard-won life they had built together, with the creek running strong and steady below them, water enough now for every family along its banks, and no more secrets left unspoken between them to cloud a single evening that remained.